this session about the Defence Reserves Association conference and some issues around the future of the Defence Organisation and the reserves as part of that. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the bigger strategic and domestic and political environment and what that seems to mean for defence, and then what are some of the implications for reserves within that. And I haven't got every answer around this, but I think some of these issues and pressures are so important that they're worth outlining. And if people disagree with what I'm saying, that's fine. But I think the issues and challenges I'm going to talk about need to be thought through, and there need to be defence and bigger national responses. So starting with the strategic environment that defence is operating in, it's really a case of 4 C's and 1 big T that describe that environment. And the 4 C's are COVID, climate change and China, and the T is technology. Now, each of these big factors is working with the others, and any policy or action that addresses one has consequences and implications for the others. But if we take COVID as an example, COVID is certainly a global pandemic and global rolling crisis, but it's also a domestic disaster and crisis. And you can see the way the federal government and the state premiers and territory chief ministers think about domestic crises. They think that the ADF is relevant when there's a large domestic crisis. And we're seeing with COVID that the use of the ADF is quite novel when you look at previous uses of the military and all of that infrastructure for use of the ADF, defence assistance to the civil community. And I think the big reason for that is when governments look for tools and levers when they have problems, there aren't all that many tools and levers in the federal government's hands, because a lot of the federal departmental infrastructure, policy making, payment making and regulatory outfits, there aren't many organisations in the Commonwealth that have people and machines that have discipline and skill and can apply those things flexibly. So defence becomes a default source of tools, people, machines, and ability to do things rather than talk about things or call meetings. So for domestic disasters, that means there will be an abiding tendency for governments to turn to defence in ways that defence may not want and may not be well structured to meet. Climate change. Well, the data on climate change has been in for some time, but we can now see what it really means. And unfortunately for Australia, we live in a part of the world that is a climate change hotspot. It's already a natural disaster hotspot. I'm talking about Southeast Asia, the South Pacific, and Australia, particularly the southeast coast of Australia and Victoria. That part of Australia is a global fire zone. All that gets worse with climate change, and we've seen the start of that back in 2019. Seems a long time ago, before the pandemic. But the South Pacific is also a place that's already subject to numerous natural disasters, whether it's storms or other kinds of natural weather and climate-driven events. And Southeast Asia on the Pacific Ring of Fire already has plenty of natural disasters. We don't have to think back too far to think of some big ones. I just mentioned Aceh, the tsunami, and the massive devastation that caused. So that's the region we're already in, and all of that gets much worse with compounding climate change impacts. And let me just give you a few of those. So Southeast Asian populations and the South Pacific depend on fish protein for a lot of their diet. Fish stocks breed in coral reefs. Coral reefs are dying as a result of climate change, means those fishery nurseries also cease to create the kind of fish stocks they used to. That is layered onto chronic overfishing already. And then other food security issues like crop failures, not just in one part of the world, but multiple parts of the world, can affect food security in Southeast Asian states. So that's 600 million people to our north living in increasing food security. And then, of course, other adverse weather events, extreme storms and flooding in low-lying coastal areas. And in Southeast Asia, low-lying coastal areas are where some of their largest cities are, Jakarta being an example. And in the South Pacific, small sea level rises have big impacts on some of these small island states, making them more exposed to extreme weather events and real scale disasters for their entire populations. Now, the reason I'm harping on this is in Australian history, when a disaster happens in the South Pacific or in Southeast Asia, again, it's that thing about who has people and machines and can go and do things to help in the world, whether it's locally or in the region. And the answer is yes, the development part of Foreign Affairs does, the Federal Police does, a whole bunch of NGOs do. But guess what? They tend to need the backbone and framework of all the things that defence can do, deploying into austere environments, providing air and sea lift, providing sanitation and some discipline and security to make the whole thing work, laced together with command and control, with a bunch of flexible, skilled people. So when I look out over the next, from now to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, the next 15 years, and I look at the effects we are already seeing and are likely to see more of from climate change, this is going to be an abiding mission for the ADF. And because some of the skills and disciplines are in really short supply, I think about some of the sanitation engineers, medical people, communications, logistics. There are going to be real strains on what is a small defence force, and being able to have the reserves contribute to those kinds of missions and those kind of scarce skills will be a legitimate expectation that the federal government has, and I think the Australian population have. Now that brings me to China. So if COVID and climate change, the first three Cs, weren't going to have implications for the reserves and the defence organisation and defence force, well, the strategic challenge of China certainly does. That's why the government, back in July last year, it seems a long time ago, changed a fundamental assumption about Australian security and about the way the defence organisation needs to think and work. It ended the assumption that Australia had at least 10 years warning time before perhaps having to be involved in major conflict. And that's way beyond Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and East Timor. Major conflict means conflict with a major power that has sophisticated capabilities and knows how to employ them. And the most likely adversary in our region is China. It's not Australia having a conflict with China alone, but China's a big and capable enough actor that a major conflict involving China, even with America and all its allies and partners, would be an unpredictable and major conflict that we should perhaps just call a war. Now, there are some real tensions between what I'm telling you, because again, a small ADF, about 65,000 permanent ADF personnel, isn't going to be able to sustain itself in major conflict for very long. There are going to be immediate needs to replace and sustain the people and machines. And the reserves are going to be a natural part of that warfighting capability. But I've just been telling you about another set of demands that I think are equally not discretionary for the defence organisation, and the reserves are going to be right in the middle of that. So this is a conundrum unless it's faced and addressed. And the way that the defence organisation has liked to address the demands from things like disaster relief, without them being at the kind of scale and concurrency that I think we can expect. The way that defence has preferred to do this has been to tell governments, look, we're a defence force. We're a force that provides lethal force in the world to advance Australian security interests. We don't do training and equipping for things like disaster relief because we can't dilute our warfighting capability. And so we will do things to help with those other tasks, but we'll do them with the people and the training and equipment that we assemble for our primary warfighting mission. Now, I don't think that's going to work because, as I've said, when the cabinet is assembled during any national or regional crisis and they go around the table about who can do what, it's the defence minister that has people and machines who can go and do things, real things in the world, in difficult places. And just for that defence minister in those discussions to say, look, I know you're giving me $45 billion a year, but I can't help because my people are preparing for war. And war is credible and they can't be distracted. So the only contribution I can make is a partial one. And by the way, if you'd like medical or airlift assistance, well, we're a bit stretched at the moment and we've got a lot of training on. So I'll make a very limited contribution. They can't do that. They also can't say, well, the equipment that I have, I'll deploy to do these missions, and I can do that at low risk and it will be effective. It might be a bit of a sensitive example to raise, but I think the MRH-90 helicopter that started that large wildfire in the Namadgi National Park that threatened lives and property in Canberra and parts of New South Wales, that's an example of an organisation not training and equipping for a mission and then not having the ability to say no to a mission. So what's the answer? Am I saying, well, the ADF and the reserves need to re-roll and focus just on domestic disaster and regional disaster relief and forget about warfighting? No, but equally pretending that the kind of contribution that defence is going to need to make to regional and domestic disaster relief operations can be made out of the force that's being designed and equipped for warfighting, that's wrong. And in fact, it's going to lead to nasty results for defence, the Namadgi fire being a foretaste of that. So the answer to me is the defence organisation needs to stop denying that it's got these two missions, and it needs to make a case for resourcing to the government to build a proper capability to do these regional and domestic disaster relief missions. Without doing that, it is going to undercut its warfighting capability, because while it puts its fingers in its ears, the government is going to make legitimate demands of the defence organisation. So the answer is to properly resource, train and equip defence, and to blister on an organisation a bit like Border Force that uses all of the institutional processes and power of the defence organisation, and means you're not building a duplicative organisation. And for those that say, well, it's just not defence's job, the problem is, if it's somebody else's job, who is this somebody else? And the answer is, we don't have them. We've got the State Emergency Service, we've got the Rural Fire Service, we've got the AFP, and we've got the various state organisations. And we know none of that is enough, none of that scales to meet the problem. And when it's regional deployment, you need the backbone of everything that defence has. So that's my answer to the challenge, but I think that is the challenge that the reserves face and the broader ADF face. And technological change only makes warfighting harder, but it does give some opportunities for preventative capabilities and work around disaster relief and the impact of the rolling crises we can expect in Southeast Asia from climate change. Thanks very much for the chance to talk to you, and I hope that this perspective adds in to the other ones that you heard during the conference. And I'm delighted to be a part of this discussion. Thank you.